Well, thank all of you for being here tonight. I realize that this is a very controversial topic, so I'm really encouraged to see that on a university campus where free thinking should be encouraged, that so many people are willing to keep an open mind about that topic. Because the assertion of tonight's presenters and presentation is that pornography fuels the rape culture. And I know that that's a very controversial statement to make because just some time ago I wrote an article titled Porn Fuels Rape Culture, and I promptly got very strong criticism from both sides of the fence. I had conservatives tell me that since rape culture didn't exist and there was no explosion of sexual assault in our culture, that any argument I tried to make about pornography, even if they themselves were opposed to it, was simply a non-starter, and they didn't see why I was trying to co-opt this type of terminology to make my case. Those who were prone to defend porn stated that there was no correlation whatsoever between pornography and sexual violence, ignoring the fact that, as I'm going to show you this evening, much of pornography now is sexual violence, and I've never quite been able to figure out and have never gotten an answer from any of those who defended this type of porn when I asked them questions like, so do you think the girls getting beaten up in porn movies actually enjoy it? Or secondarily, don't you think it's extremely creepy and misogynist for a guy to enjoy a girl getting beaten up or otherwise abused? So I know this topic is very controversial because both sides of the fence, both those who are pro-porn and those who are opposed to porn, have stated that this thesis is very controversial. Now, this topic does have to be undergone very, very sensitively because, as the introducer pointed out, we are talking about sexual assault and we are talking about rape, and these topics do have to be approached very delicately. But it's because these are such delicate and important matters, very important cultural matters, and because these discussions are occurring across our country and on this very campus, that I think we have to have these discussions in the first place. Now, just to briefly take a look at why I'm saying that pornography is not just wrong and misogynist and anti-feminist and all these types of things, but why porn is rape culture. Because a lot of people, as I've pointed out, have basically stated that the way we're defining it isn't correct. Well, most of the definitions of rape culture that I've found have said that essentially the basic concept is that rape culture can develop when, quote, prevalent attitudes and practices normalize, excuse, tolerate, and even condone rape. To continue quoting here, examples of this behavior are victim blaming, sexual objectification, and trivializing rape, end quote. So the case I'm going to make for you in the next 20 minutes is that pornography fuels the rape culture because it normalizes rape, because it trivializes rape, and it sexually objectifies women. And once I've made this case, I'd be more than happy to take any questions you have on this. And now, the first point I want to make is that the rates of pornography use in our culture today are pandemic, because one of the two words here that we're looking at is culture. So in order for me to make my case, I first have to establish that pornography is indeed a pervasive cultural problem. So let's look through some of the newest statistics to analyze whether or not pornography actually is a cultural problem. First, 64 to 68% of young adult men and about 18% of women use pornography at least once every single week. An additional 17% of men and another 30% of women use pornography 1 to 2 times every month. But according to data taken from internet users who took part in a general social survey, men are 543% more likely to look at porn than females, which is because men are more visually driven. One of the things I noticed when I was doing research for this topic was that originally Hugh Hefner, the founder of Playboy, when he tried to prove that women were just as visual and just as attracted towards men, he came out with Playgirl magazine to prove this. And he soon discovered that Playgirl magazine was also a big bestseller and thought that proved his point. Until they did the research, the market research, to find out who was buying it, and it turned out that it was gay men who were buying Playgirl, not women. So, moving on with our statistics here, 35% of teen boys say they have viewed pornographic videos, quote, more times than they can count. And it gets worse. 15% of boys and 9% of girls say they have already seen child pornography. 32% of boys and 18% of girls have already seen bestiality online. This is all under the age of 18, by the way. 39% of boys and 23% of girls have seen sexual bondage online. And 83% of boys and 57% of girls have seen group sex online. And I think especially relevant for this campus setting with this discussion we're having surrounding rape culture, 2/3 of college-age men and 1/2 of college-age women say that viewing pornography is an acceptable and healthy outlet for sexuality. As Dr. Mary Ann Layden, who's the director of the Sexual Trauma and Psychopathology Department at the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Pennsylvania, said, quote, "It is not surprising that many psychologists call internet pornography the new crack cocaine. When you note the combination of the power of pornography with the ready 24/7 availability of pornography on any computer, much of it free and accessible in the privacy of our own home." And as those statistics that I just gave you indicate, the majority of our culture is engaging in this type of behavior. And the reason that many psychologists refer to pornography as the new crack cocaine is how sustained pornography use does impact the brain. It fires off neurotransmitters called erototoxins, which create new neural pathways in the brain that cannot be subverted and are often unerasable. These neural pathways create an addiction so strong that it is often harder to quit a pornography addiction than it is to quit crack cocaine. So I think that by taking a basic look at these statistics, we can establish that pornography is a huge cultural problem, because even those who defend porn, I don't think are going to defend the fact that the majority of children under the age of 18 are seeing things that are absolutely brutal, such as child pornography, bestiality, etc. So this leads me to my second main point. We've established that pornography is a cultural problem, that if, for example, you are not using pornography right now in North America, you are part of a very distinct minority, according to statistics that came out last year. So the second question then that we have to ask ourselves when establishing that pornography fuels rape culture is, what kind of porn are people watching? Well, after an analysis was done of top-selling pornographic content, 304 sex scenes were observed for both physical and verbal aggression. 88% of these scenes contained strong physical aggression, much including physical beating. 49% of these scenes contained verbal aggression, primarily extremely crude name-calling. Now, for example, a lot of people, when I bring this up, say, you know, it's consensual, and porn defenders have pointed to someone who's now known as the Duke University porn star, who goes under the porn name Belle Knox, but has been recently revealed to be the 18-year-old Miriam Weeks, who is a girl who is shooting porn films to pay her way through university. And she said in a media interview that, quote, "Being in porn is freeing, it is empowering, it is wonderful, it is how the world should be." This encouraged a lot of those who support pornography use to say, look at that. Here's an 18-year-old girl who's starring in porn, paying her way through university, and she's saying that it's empowering and how the world should be. But 2 weeks ago, this story was reported. Former porn star Shelley Lubin of the Pink Cross Foundation has now posted a graphic video showing a male pornographic actor repeatedly choking, slapping, shaking, and verbally abusing Weeks. How does it make you personally feel to watch degrading sex or see women being degraded and treated like shit or just objectified? A male interviewer asked Weeks. Hot, Weeks replied. A muscular actor then grabs her around the throat as she fights to loosen his grip around her larynx. After learning she describes herself as a feminist, the man slaps her numerous times, telling her that she is worthless. As a trail of moisture trickles from her eyes down her haggard face, he says, "Feminism 101, right here," before continuing his assault. Now, regardless of what Miss Weeks says is empowering and wonderful and how the world should be, I think anyone, short of a very creepy misogynist, would agree with me that that is absolutely not wonderful and absolutely not how the world should be. And yet people are choosing to consume this as recreation and entertainment. The fact remains, however, that the reason violence and pornography is on the rise and becoming prevalent is because there is a market demand for that kind of pornography, and that market demand is growing by the week. For example, according to Carlos Scalisi, the owner of a porn company, 21 Sexury Video, quote, "Amateurs come across better on screen. Our customers feel that. Especially by women, you can see it. They can still feel strong pain." Causing pain is not just a side effect of the porn business anymore. In many, many cases, causing pain is the porn business because that's what the customers are asking for. One former porn star, Taniel Burleson, who went under the porn name Jersey Jackson, revealed that, quote, "Guys are punching you in the face. You get ripped. Your insides can come out of you. It's never ending. You're viewed as an object, not a human with a spirit. People do drugs because they can't deal with the way they're being treated." Another former porn star recently revealed on Shelley Lubin's website that after she signed a contract saying that she was going to do vaginal sex in one scene, a group of male porn actors pinned her down and she was anally penetrated until she blacked out. When she came to, they shipped her off to the hospital to get stitched back up and then cowed her into silence. Gail Deans, who is a renowned feminist and the author of a book called Pornland, How Porn Has Hijacked Our Sexuality, found in her research that the most popular internet pornography involved a woman being penetrated in various ways by 3 or more men at the same time, often with the woman gagging uncontrollably. The second favorite type of internet pornography had the man ejaculating directly into the woman's eyes or face. So I've shown you what the most popular porn movies are by the statistics. This, according to Gail Deans, is the most popular type of internet pornography, which is why more and more of this is being produced in the first place. Now, the stories could go on and on. I could, if I had a lot more time, give you many more examples of porn stars who talk about how they end up getting gang raped on sets. They sign consent forms and they're forced into things they didn't consent to. One woman who actually said that when she signed up for something completely different, she was penetrated by 2 men at the same time. Porn actresses being talked about how they're basically physically wrecked after one porn shoot. I could go through all these stories in gruesome detail, but I would encourage you to look them up for yourself. Because in the porn industry, women are at this point nothing more than objects. They're props, and they're being sold as objects that can take massive amounts of pain for the pleasure of the male viewer that is increasingly choosing to consume this type of pornography on a mass scale. Now, according to Dr. Robert Jensen of the University of Texas, who, by the way, is not morally opposed to pornography, in his paper, Pornography and Sexual Violence, he said this, quote, "My own studies and reviews of other examinations of content suggest there are a few basic themes in pornography. 1, all women at all times want sex from all men. 2, women enjoy all the sexual acts that men perform or demand. And 3, any woman who does not at first realize this can be easily turned with a little force, although force is rarely necessary because most of the women in pornography are the imagined nymphomaniacs about whom many fantasize," end quote. I think this speaker, or this, academic, clearly highlights what we've seen in the statistics about what kind of porn is being produced and why it's changing the way, in many cases, men view women and skewing the gender dynamics on a mass scale. This leads me to my third main point. We've now established that porn is a rampant and growing cultural problem that affects, literally at this point, everybody in our culture. If you're not looking at porn yourself, most of your friends are. You all know people who are looking at pornography. We've also established that pornography, especially the newest pornography coming out, overwhelmingly depicts sexual violence against women, and in many cases actually is the sexual violence that is depicted. One expert who was testifying in Iceland when the Icelandic government was discussing banning porn noted that the difference between physical violence in film is that that's just a depiction of violence, whereas in pornography, the actress actually has to experience the fantasy that's being filmed. It's actual violence taking place, complete with tearing, ripping, and all the other violent things that people seem to think is entertaining, recreational, or somehow a valid form of expression. As Gail Deans pointed out, this isn't a valid form of sexual expression. This is nothing short of hate speech against women. So I think that at this point, I shouldn't have to make the case that porn fuels rape culture. If you look at the basic statistics of how many people are looking at porn, if you look at the basic statistics of what kind of porn that they're looking at, I think that the conclusion draws itself. If people are increasingly watching sexual violence, sexual assault, and rape as recreational or entertainment, then obviously rape is being trivialized. Because I don't think anybody who can sit and watch a porn film of a woman being brutally raped or degraded in any of the ways I described previously and say that that's in any way empowering or wonderful. I think that we have to look at that and say, yes, that perpetuates rape culture because that woman is being raped and these people are watching that as if it's entertainment. So anyone taking a cursory glance at the evidence already has to admit that this conclusion is almost self-evident, but because many people try to point out that, well, not all studies show causation between sexual assault, physical sexual assault, and pornography, once again ignoring the fact that much of pornography is sexual assault. So therefore, the porn fuels rape culture thesis doesn't hold up. So to buffer my first 2 points, I want to take a look at the third point, which is that porn trivializes rape, and the academic evidence on this is crystal clear. So for example, as cited by the Berkman Center for Internet and Society at Harvard Law School, and these are excerpts of the report of the Attorney General's Commission on Pornography, section 5.2.1, if you want to look it up, on sexually violent material. Quote, clinical and experimental research has focused particularly on sexually violent material, and the conclusions have been virtually unanimous. In both clinical and experimental settings, exposure to sexually violent materials has indicated an increase in the likelihood of aggression. More specifically, the research shows a causal relationship between exposure to material of this type and aggressive behavior towards women. The evidence also strongly supports the conclusion that substantial exposure to violent, sexually explicit material leads to a greater acceptance of rape myth, which, understood in its broader sense, is that women enjoy being coerced into sexual activity, that they enjoy being physically hurt in the sexual context, and that as a result, a man who forces himself on a woman sexually is in fact merely acceding to the real wishes of the woman, regardless of the extent to which she seems to be resisting, which of course is the theme of much of the porn films and the internet pornography coming out right now, so of course that makes a lot of sense. Now to requote Mary Ann Layden, the director of sexual trauma and psychopathology at the Department of Psychiatry at Pennsylvania U, she also writes a fascinating paper that I would encourage everybody here to read called Pornography and Violence, A New Look at Research. You can Google it, it's available online. She says this, quote, for many reasons, as we shall see, pornography is a very effective teacher of beliefs and behaviors, and one that also teaches its users that the behaviors are acceptable and stimulates them to do so. And she points out that this is because pornography is inherently stimulating. Continuing on, males who viewed sexual violence obtained higher scores on scales measuring acceptance of interpersonal violence and rape myth when compared to males who viewed either a physically violent or a neutral film. The increase in attitudes supporting sexual violence following exposure to pornography is greater if the pornography is violent than if it is not violent. A similar effect, however, is seen even when the pornography is not violent. Males who were shown non-violent scenes that sexually objectified and degraded women and were then exposed to material that depicted rape indicated that the rape victim experienced pleasure and, quote, got what she wanted. I'm sure you're seeing a pattern here. Even women who were exposed to pornography as a child have a greater acceptance of the rape myth than those who were not. Those exposed to pornography recommend a sentence for rapists that was half of that recommended by those shown non-pornographic imagery. These subjects appear to have trivialized the crime of rape, end quote. But the evidence goes further, and because this topic has proven so controversial, I want to make sure that it's crystal clear to everybody in the audience that beyond just its intuitively conclusion that porn fuels rape culture, the academic evidence is overwhelmingly on the side of this conclusion as well. For example, in a meta-analysis of 46 studies published from 1962 to 1995, comprising a total sample of 12,323 people, researchers concluded that pornographic material puts one at an increased risk of committing sexual offenses, a 22% increase, and accepting rape myth, a 31% increase. In a meta-analysis of 24 studies conducted between 1980 and 1993, with a total of 4,268 participants, researchers positively correlated rape myth acceptance to exposure to non-violent or violent pornography. And here we see that the way pornography degrades women just as human beings also lends itself to rape myth, because what we have taking place here is a dehumanization process. There was one porn producer, actually, who said very recently in an interview that what I do is more or less the slave trade. I buy and sell human flesh. Just like dehumanization was needed for the slave trade, dehumanization is also the result of sustained porn use. Among perpetrators of sex crimes, adolescent exposure to pornography is a significant predictor of elevated violence and victim humiliation, which I think is very significant in the context of what types of porn people are choosing to watch now, where generally the woman is being humiliated by more than 3 men. In a study of 187 female university students, researchers concluded that early exposure to pornography was related to subsequent, quote, rape fantasies and attitudes supportive of sexual violence against women. Researchers believe pornography consumed at a young age contributes to women being socialized to accept sexual aggression as a sexual or romantic event. In other words, when women are consuming the same type of porn, they start to destigmatize rape even in their own mind, and to see what is explicitly sexually violent as something that could be a legitimate sexual avenue or even something acceptable inside the romantic context. Much of the data I don't have time to share with you talks about how wives, even at battered women's shelters, talked about how their husbands tried to force them into doing all sorts of things they didn't want to do because that husband was viewing porn and wanted to try his fantasies out on his wife. Leading from that same study, in 2004, data was collected from interviews with 271 women participating in a battered women's program. Pornography use by their partner significantly increased the odds of women being sexually abused by their abusers. When their abuser used both alcohol and pornography, the odds of sexual abuse increased by a factor of 3.2. So I'm not just making the case in this presentation tonight that there is a direct correlation between pornography and physical real-world violence. But that case can very, very easily be made. I just don't have enough time to make it this evening. A Japanese study showed that when Japanese males were divided into 3 groups and each exposed to different types of home and video pornography, a positive rape film where the female expressed pleasure, a negative rape film where the female expressed pain, or a consenting sex film, those who viewed the positive rape film were significantly more likely to state that women could enjoy rape, and higher percentages of rape cases were invented by victims. And I could go on with the academic evidence, but I think that the academic evidence speaks overwhelmingly to the fact that when people engage in sustained porn use, where people are being dehumanized for one-sided sexual consumption, and when that pornography use is increasingly including pain and violence as status quo, that this begins to fuel rape culture. Just to conclude this part of the presentation and go over my 3 points one more time. First, we see by the statistics that pornography is a huge cultural problem. Because just looking at the statistics, based on how young people are beginning to view pornography and how many people are viewing pornography, if you do not use pornography at least twice monthly, you are a very small minority in North America. That establishes pornography as a cultural problem. Second of all, what kind of pornography are people consuming? The studies done and the evidence shows that increasingly the pornography being consumed by people is overwhelmingly violent towards women. 88% of the 304 top sex scenes in the best-selling porn movies contained very explicit physical violence, and 49% contained verbal aggression, such as crude name-calling, which we saw in the example of Belle Knox, where she was called all sorts of names by the man beating her up in that film. We also see from Gail Deans that these women are being subjected to often what amounts to gang rape. They're often not consenting to it, and what takes place on these porn sets is rape. So often the people consuming these films are actually watching, as entertainment, a real live rape actually playing out. And third of all, academics show in every study that there is a correlation between those who view pornography at all, but especially those who view violent pornography, and acceptance of rape myth, which is somehow the belief that women are not that physically harmed by rape, that rape is actually what they want, and that rape is not a big deal. So I think when you look at this body of evidence, and this is just a small sampling of the evidence available, we have to conclude that because pornography trivializes rape and normalizes rape, and people are now consuming what amounts to rape as recreational activity, as entertainment, that pornography fuels rape culture. So that ends my section of the presentation, and now for the second section, I'd like to welcome up my friend Daniel Gilman, who interns at a local church here. He has worked on Parliament Hill fighting sex trafficking, and he has his master's degree in the fight to end the slave trade in Great Britain. Daniel.
Thanks, Jonathan. 3 nights ago, one of my roommates had a dream, and in this dream he was being trafficked. He's a big, muscular guy. He's huge. He towers over me and all the other housemates. And so he's not a guy that's used to being pushed around. But in this dream, as he was describing it to me, he was telling me about how he was being whipped, he was being gagged, he was being brutalized, abused. He woke up from this nightmare. Breathed a sigh of relief. It was just a dream. Because his living reality is not one of being trafficked, being abused in any way. The only time he's ever going to experience something that horrific is in his dreams. The reason I'm so excited to see so many people here, you guys actually came, and that's awesome. And the reason it's awesome, the reason I'm so encouraged to be with you today, is that for 27 million people around the globe,